We're hearing a lot about regulation in the cryptocurrency space these days.
Stablecoin.
Real stablecoins.
Stablecoin regulation.
And the regulations behind stablecoins is one of the most controversial topics in the crypto world right now.
There's renewed interest to make stablecoin the first piece of the legislative puzzle. And why? There's a sense among a number of members of Congress that something must be done. And stablecoin is the first piece because it's a narrower issue.
So crypto has made it faster and cheaper than ever before to rip off consumers.
Regulators and the Biden administration have their eye on them, warning that stablecoins threaten financial stability.
There's a lot of work to be done to really protect the investing public.
But what if the current debate over stablecoin regulations is missing a vital piece of information? What if a little-known loophole that's been around for decades totally changes the game? In this video, we're going to talk about just that.
I hope one good thing that comes out of this FTX disaster for their investors and their employees is that we see an acceleration towards regulation.
Right.
I think it's important for people in the crypto space to not only know the legal terrain of what's already possible, but to see what kinds of lessons they can derive from the history of the banking system in order to strengthen their position in the cryptocurrency debate. So before we dive into that, let's talk about what a stablecoin actually is.
Because all a stablecoin really means is that it's a cryptocurrency linked to some type of asset. So that could be, there are a few that are linked to the price of gold or the price of oil, but most of them are tied to the price of the US dollar.
Right.
And so most of the companies that are issuing those stable coins, what they do is they say, this is like an electronic dollar that is redeemable for a real US dollar, right? And so that's basically just like a banknote. That's what banks used to do.
Thomas is senior research faculty at AIER, formerly the chief economist for the US Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs.
For most of US history, we had private banks that issued banknotes, usually redeemable for gold.
When we were on the gold standard, banks used to lock up your gold in a vault for safekeeping. They gave you a piece of paper or a banknote, which was pegged to that gold in the vault. That's until, of course, FDR seized and hoarded all of private citizens' gold and began the great decoupling from the domestic gold standard in 1933. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, they started to issue their own banknotes. There were still some private banks that issued their own notes, but regulations built up and built up over time that made it more and more expensive for them. Also, the government created taxes on the issuance of banknotes, which intentionally made it prohibitively expensive.
When the Civil War happened, the federal government took a stronger role in the banking system in a couple of ways. First of all, the federal government issued their own banknotes. The government did. These were greenbacks. This is where the term greenback came from. We had national banknotes from the Civil War until the founding of the Fed in 1913. In 1913, the Federal Reserve starts to issue national notes, and we talk about them. We talk about the Fed as a monopoly on banknotes. But as Schuler points out, it wasn't a technical monopoly. There wasn't a law that said only the Federal Reserve can issue banknotes. They did the same thing that they did to the state banks, where they put a tax on the federal banks, and they just made it incrementally harder and harder for those national banks to issue notes until it was only the Fed doing it. Right? And so that's why, like you said, the national banks had still issued all these notes, but the amount of notes went down and down and down over time until there was only a few million left, and the Federal Reserve just became dominant. And so they didn't have a stated legal monopoly, they had this implicit monopoly.
So basically, the pressure from the regulators pushed out competing banknotes, leaving the Federal Reserve national banknotes as what's essentially a monopoly on money. But here's where it gets interesting. In 2001, US Treasury economist Kurt Schuler discovered something very interesting. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, there were a series of bank reforms. In this period, it turns out that the indirect rules and taxes that had made it too expensive for banks to issue their own banknotes were quietly repealed. What does this mean? It means that the issuance of private banknotes is technically legal. So this is huge, and here's why. With the rise of crypto, and particularly in the case of stablecoins, Thomas Hogan argues that electronic stablecoins are the modern analog to paper banknotes. So remember that gold-backed banknote? Many like Tom argue that stablecoins should be treated in the same way.
Issuing electronic banknotes, you'd think that should be done by the banking system. And also, it's regulated. If regular people are worried about the value of those banknotes, and if regulators themselves are worried about spillovers into the financial system, then having banks doing it is potentially the best place. There are a couple banks that want to try to do this. Specifically, Wyoming is a state that has been very friendly to the crypto industry and has allowed banks to hold crypto. And so some of those banks are trying to move to national charters or at least get access to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has basically stonewalled them.
So just as I was in the final phases of editing this video, one of the banks from Wyoming came out with a statement about their latest interactions with the Fed. The Fed advised Custodia 72 hours ago that it could either withdraw its membership application or see it denied, and the Fed denied it in record time. Custodia offered a safe, federally regulated, solvent alternative to the reckless speculators and grifters of crypto that penetrated the US banking system, with disastrous results for some banks. Custodia actively sought federal regulation going above and beyond all requirements that apply to traditional banks. The board's denial is unfortunate, but consistent with the concerns that Custodia has raised about the Federal Reserve's handling of its applications, an issue we will continue to litigate. Why are regulators and politicians rushing in to restrict it when the framework for banks issuing stablecoins already exists? Are they ideologically opposed to cryptocurrency? Well, it doesn't look like it. I mean, the Fed, central banks, and governments worldwide have been in serious discussions about their own kind of crypto for a while now, with pilot projects already launched in many countries.
Central bank digital currencies could be a digital version of money, a bit like a digital banknote that could be used alongside physical notes and coins. Unlike most of the digital money people use daily today, it would be issued directly by a central bank, like the Bank of England in the UK. And governments and central banks across the world are working together, looking into what having a digital currency might mean in practice.
Given their track record, it would be wholly unsurprising if they did everything in their power to quash out competition, like they did with private banknotes in the past.
In every other industry, if you asked an economist, what's the best thing the market could do? How do we get to a good market outcome? And they would say, competition. We have lots of buyers and sellers, and they're going to compete, and that's going to lead to the best possible price, except in terms of money. For some reason, in terms of money, they want a monopoly, right, and they want the government to run that monopoly. These are both things that in any other industry you would say, no, we don't want the government running this industry. We don't want a single monopoly in this industry. But for some reason, in terms of money, they want both of those.
Although regulators' stated reason is to protect consumers and stabilize the banking system, and maybe many of them even truly believe that their means and their ends are justified, history has shown that the result of these types of regulations for banknotes have achieved the ends of destroying competition and creating a monetary monopoly. It appears that we're at this fork in the road. So the feds can either allow for crypto competition, use the existing legal framework, and let the market figure it out. 2, they could issue their own stablecoin, like FedCoin, and try to regulate away private competition like they've done in the past. Or 3, they could go full China style and issue a programmable digital dollar, the CBDC. So do you think that it's inevitable that stablecoins will have the same fate as private banknotes? Or do you think that there will be another outcome that I haven't even spoken about here? Let me know what you think in the comments below.